because the entheogens are by definition plants that are used in a spiritual context, I thought it would be good to review the many different kinds of religious ideas that we find in different entheogenic traditions and practices. So finding a way into this rather large topic is quite difficult, so I thought I'd start at a very specific point and work out from there. I'd like to talk about a myth amongst the Huichol Indians in northern Mexico. Now, the Huichol are very well known for their use of peyote. They're quite famous for the role that peyote plays in their religion. What is less known as some of the other systems, subsystems of shamanism, or other distinct systems of shamanism practiced by the Huichol. And some of these tell us about peyote and other entheogens through the myth. So we're looking at the mythic level of entheogenic use in a traditional culture. So the Huichol are well known for their peyote use. And here there is a Huichol yarn painting showing Huichol people sitting around and consuming peyote in a sacred context and communicating with Tatawari, the deity of fire, grandfather fire, a very important spiritual being for the Huichol. So Tatawari fire is, of course, in many societies, fire is central to what it means to be human. It's a very, very important thing that distinguishes us from other species. So fire is a very sacred human spiritual connection. What is a lot less known is the wolf shamanism amongst the Huichol, and it's very interesting. It involves spending time with wolves, getting to know them. So specific, highly trained shamans will spend time out with the wolves and relating to them. And there's a particular reason for this, because long, long ago, people were wolves for the Huichol. So the ancestors were wolves. And they were very happy, except that they were out in the elements, they were exposed to the rain, they had no fire, they had no shelter. And Brother Dia, another deity of the Huichol, Brother Dia felt sorry for them and thought, well, how can I help these people? How can I help people? So Dia gave chase. The deer ran past the wolves were hungry, they chased Brother Dia, and after a long run, they eventually caught Brother Dia and tore him to pieces and began eating Brother Dia. And while this was happening, Brother Dia shapeshifted into peyote. So as the wolves were eating the deer turned into the peyote, and the wolves started to have visions. So these people who were animals started to have these visions that were divine. And through this process, they became human. They were able to interact with Grandfather Fire and gain the attributes that we associate with being people, with being human. So these wolves became people. And they were very happy with what they were learning about being people, what they were learning about fire and peyote. And here is the Brother Dia, the peyote. But they also started to miss their relatives who had remained wolves. So the people wanted to be able to stay in touch with their wolf relatives. And another plant decided to help them. This is the kiri plant, which is in the nightshade family, the datura family. Through eating this plant, people can shapeshift. So here is a plant that takes us back from the human into the animal world again. And this plant is instrumental in the wolf shamanism of Huichol. So here we see a shaman under the kiri tree, the kiri vine, which reaches over them, communicating with the different animals by means of this entheogen. So here are a constellation of religious ideas linked to these plants that change consciousness. The idea of changing into animal form and communicating with animals through plants is very widespread, and it is especially associated with plants in the nightshade family. So we find it in early modern Europe, in medieval Europe, going right back to classical antiquity in the Mediterranean and in ancient like Neolithic Germany. There are traditions of using the nightshade plants in association with animal transformation and astral flight as well. So here we have the deadly nightshade, Atropa belladonna, and Hyoscyamus niger, and images of woodblocks of witches transforming into animals. It's also associated with the very, very ancient artifacts associated with San Pedro use in northern Peru. there's an ancient complex of San Pedro and animals. They go together. The wild animal and the San Pedro have a special link. So the shamanism is really an animal shamanism as well as this broader healing system. So these are 5,000-year-old ceramics and carvings. They're very, very ancient artifacts demonstrating the connection between animals and San Pedro. The datura is also associated with the ancestors, because it's believed that once the daturas were twins that wandered all over the surface of the world. They wandered all over the different lands and they saw everything and took everything in. They became very knowledgeable. Now, some of the deities were upset that these twins knew so much about them and about everything. And so they wanted these twins to be quiet and not to go around spreading their secrets because they knew so much. So as a kind of punishment, the twins were turned into the datura plants and scattered to the 4 directions. The figure here in the right is a Zuni rain priest. The Zuni rain priest have a special relationship with the daturas and can use them to contact the ancestors for divination and for meteorological magic. The connection between entheogens and the ancestors is very widespread. Here we find it in West Africa amongst the Bwiti and the earlier antecedents of the Bwiti religion before the Fang migrated into Gabon. That the idea that the iboga plant was once an ancestor. The ancestor was murdered in this case, and his wife, seeking him in the forest, eventually found the plant and through a dream knew to eat the plant and had communion with this ancestor who was the first person to be able to communicate back from the ancestral realm to the living realm. So the idea that the sacred plant was once a human is very, very widespread. It's widespread in the Pacific with the kava plant, where there are many stories of the kava plant growing from the body of an ancestor. We find it in Peru as well, where a defeated king wished to return to the world of the living so that he could offer advice so that other people wouldn't repeat his mistakes, that he could come and help people to avoid the things that led to his death and his demise. To alleviate that suffering, he returned as a plant that teaches. Elsewhere, it's very widespread to have a kind of animism where the sacred plants are thought to be inhabited by spirit beings. Throughout much of Europe, especially in Russia, there are ideas that the ergot fungus that grows on the infected rye are spirit beings that have their own special agendas, often quite malevolent in this case. So here are pictures of the wicked ergot spirits. But the broader idea of the spirit in the plant is universal. It's quite cosmopolitan. The mandrake, this is from I believe a 16th century German herbal on the right, and an old cover of one of the Don Juan novels showing Mescalito, the spirit of San Pedro within the fictional world of Carlos Castaneda. And here a spirit of tobacco, so the tobacco doctor, the tobacco teacher plant. So very, very widespread, this idea of the spirit being in the plant. So moving further into this idea of the humanness, the connection to our family as people, ideas of kinship and plants having particular kinship relations to humans. So we have mother ayahuasca, or grandfather San Pedro, the idea of the kin connection, that these are part of our family. They're not merely plants, but they're spirit entities that we are related to, a part of our family. Here's a mother ayahuasca. And these spirit beings are sometimes syncretized with saints in Catholicism, as in the case of Salvia Divinorum, where the synchronization is with Mary the Shepherdess. And often these are used in rites of healing, for divination, because through the plant we can access other states of consciousness, other modes of awareness. We have access to solutions that wouldn't normally be accessible to us. So the idea of accessing a different state of consciousness to get information that can help us that we cannot normally access. So here we have Salvia divinorum being ground up to use in healing rituals and divination rituals by the Mazatec Indians of southern Mexico. So these plants are amongst a number of techniques for reaching beyond our normal awareness, accessing knowledge that we cannot normally reach, extending into other dimensions. We can do this through meditation, through dream, through spontaneous visions where our body suddenly produces these ecstatic states. We can do it through stories as well, through the myth, through the land of myth. We can actually draw this dream world into our narratives and share them as stories. So there are a number of ways that the plants are located in these ways of accessing other modes of awareness and finding solutions to our problems. And they're associated, of course, with travel, the idea of spiritual travel out of the body. So this is a picture by Dennis Constantine. So Dennis Constantine's picture of a DMT experience, travelling out of body into the spiritual world and accessing realms that are not normally accessible. This is a very widespread idea, and I mentioned earlier the plants used in traditional European witchcraft were involved in making flying ointments so that witches could fly, go on supernatural journeys out of their bodies to gain knowledge, power, wisdom through the agency of these herbs. Plants used for flight are extremely widespread. So Bucanawa is used by the Tarahumara in Mexico for astral travel out of body. The Shanxi or Coriaria timifolia is used it grows in the high Andes, and eating the berries produces sensations of flight and out-of-body experiences. Gaultheria insana, a Noah plant used for travel out of body. And of course the Amanita muscaria of the northern temperate circumpolar regions, also used for spiritual travel and an integral part of the shamanism that occurs in many circumpolar regions. These plants were so sacred that they became, they were so sacred that when missionaries came to Mexico and tried to eliminate the use of them, people would often prefer to die than to reveal the location of certain plants, to show where these plants were, or to cause any harm to them, because they were worried about the spiritual repercussions of damaging these sacred beings, these plant beings. So we have many records of people willing to essentially be martyrs for plants like the olaluki, the vine that produces the thing called round things, the olaluki seeds, which were used for divination, for travel, and for healing. The people who could prepare these plants were socially very important, because one of the things that these plants were often used for was rites of passage, transition from one state of life into another, from childhood to adulthood. And so these things were sacred medicines prepared to help people through the process of being better members of society, better members of the community. This often involved rites of passage, ordeals. The states were not necessarily very pleasant, so initiation with something like brugmansia or high doses of ayahuasca could be quite terrifying and very, very unpleasant. But the idea that that through these processes we learn to handle difficulties in life. I mean, we can prepare ourselves for other kinds of ordeals by volunteering to undergo certain ordeals in a controlled ritual context. It's a very, very powerful aid to life. And of course, they can also reach into the ecstatic states, aesthetic states, the kind of states that are part of the idea of grace rather than the fear of God. It's this kind of mercy state. These beautiful states are accessible as well. And these states are reported in all kinds of systems of spirituality, all systems of mysticism, not necessarily all plant-based, but many, many different spiritual traditions talk about these mystical, beautiful, beatific states. States of enhanced sensitivity and awareness and appreciation of beauty. So we find some very similar states reported in the meditative practices, the tantric practices, the attainment of the rainbow body. These are ideas that would be not unfamiliar to people who use entheogens as well. There are some quite strong overlaps in the phenomenology of these states. they're also socially important, and the social aspect is an important element of churches, religions. So we find that these plants also act as sacraments for communities that embody the values of communities. So different communities are attracted to, well, they incorporate different substances that are almost totems of the values that they hold. So the Native American Church uses peyote, and peyote embodies the values of the sociality of the people in the Native American Church. So there's this lovely quote here that the white man goes into church and talks about Jesus, the Indian goes into his teepee and talks with Jesus. That it is symbolic of the people. So a war against drugs is not just a war against drugs, it's a war against the people that the drugs represent symbolically. The iboga root, which gives contact with the ancestors and benevolent guidance from the force known as the Bwiti. This is also it's symbolic of the Bwiti religion. It's like a living representation of the sociality. Similarly, cannabis and LSD for the people in the 1960s that used the cannabis and LSD in North America and Europe, it symbolized their social values and ideals, the idea of being peaceful, the idea of being loving. These things were represented by the substance. So the banning of the substance is a kind of attack on those people and their mode of sociality and their values. And of course also the sociality of MDMA and the rave parties and the idea of love and being together in a state of innocence, a childlike state, and that also is a kind of sociality, a kind of value. Now the idea of the entheogen, the word itself, it comes from the words entheos, to be full of God, very closely related to our word enthusiasm, to be filled with divinity, and geniste, to bring forth. But it can also mean to be possessed, to be in a state of divine inspiration. So something that fills one with a sense of divinity. I want to talk about this idea of possession because it does occur in some of the entheogenic traditions. The conquistadors and the Catholics who came to Mexico, they saw cactus use and mushroom use as a form of possession. And so there were these pictures of the spirit beings communicating through the mushroom. And there is this element of a divine inhabiting the plant. So this plant up here is the bish plant, a kind of aconite, possibly one of the most toxic plants, certainly the most toxic plant in Europe, and possibly the most toxic plant in the world, Aconitum ferox of the Himalayas. Now, when the world was being created in the Vedas, the gods who sacrificed to each other had to battle with the asuras who sacrificed to themselves. Two different types of spirit being. Both practice sacrifice. One to one another, one just wanting the sacrifice for themselves. They mixed the world ocean using a venomous serpent, and some of that venom fell out onto the earth and became the bish plant. And Shiva tried to catch this poison. It was actually the poison that spilt from his mouth that fell to the earth that became the bish. So there was an element that bish contained Shiva. And so some very, very experienced and practiced Shivite ascetics will smoke the bish plant, even though it's incredibly toxic, in order to have this communion with Shiva. So there's another form of entheos, the god is in the plant. I just want to finish on the idea of sacrifice, because in many ways sacrifice is central to much of religious ideology. Much religion focuses on what is sacrifice for what else. And there are many kinds of sacrifice, offering incense, sacrificing an animal. All these different forms of sacrifice have been practiced. But with the entheogens, I believe what we are dealing with is sacrifice of the ego, of the human. So just as the wolves became human, the human becomes something else when they eat the food of the gods. These are the foods of the gods. They're not actually for us. So when we eat them, our ego dissolves and we participate for some hours in a more divine state of consciousness, a more holistic state of consciousness. So the sacrifice is still implicit. It's the sacrifice of our ego and our mortality as we flow back into the ocean of unity with all existence. So that's basically all I wanted to say today. Any questions or comments are welcome if there's time.
Do you have any links between the particular classes of compounds and the social rituals that go with them that would translate into a sort of culture-wide generalization?
It's really interesting, yeah. I think there is definitely, obviously, there's different needs, moods, motivations that we need to sustain at different times in our lives, and different kinds of substance, different classes of substance will help us sustain those moods. So obviously there are times when we need catecholamines. There are times where oxytocin trumps everything else, where we need to be connected to our in-group and excluding our out-group. There are times when we just have to accept everyone and everything, and that's where the serotonergic substances come into their own. But kappa agonists, NMDA antagonists, they all have their spiritual uses. Those uses are varied.
Thank you. A question here from the audience.
Hi, Des. Great talk, it's very interesting. I'm wondering, from the perspective of religion or the study of religious uses of entheogens, and the types of concepts that have been used to look at this, like soteriology and cosmology and ideologies of sacrifice and all this stuff, would you be able to make a comment on these more recent secular ideologies or uses of drugs, the recreational drugs, where people are relating to their ecstasy-like experiences with language and belief systems that are not technically religious, or at least they wouldn't associate with religion? Do you see this as reinventing certain forms of religious ideology and stuff, or is it a radical break from religion?
Yeah, very interesting question. And it goes into the whole field of what is genuinely religion, what is quasi-religious or para-religious, is football religious? There are all these different, what is going on there. But I guess it depends on how we define religion, what we're after, or we have a sociological bias. But also we have to appreciate that we have a very specific historical construction of what religion is. Many of the scholars, it would be very hard for them to get away from ideas of Christian mysticism. It would be even harder for them to step back from Neoplatonic ideas that there's some boundless thing beyond the forms of the world. We have what we think of as being essential spiritual ideas are actually historically highly specific. So it really is a matter of how far we can unpack. Because each of these things, the secular hedonic response, hedonism is really a response to older religious forms in ancient Greece. The philosophy was developed there in some ways. So really it is part of a lineage of ideas in dialogue and evolving.